Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in the small village of Domremy, a quiet settlement on the eastern borderlands of France. It was an unremarkable place, surrounded by forests, fields, and the slow-flowing Meuse River. But the world into which Joan was born was anything but peaceful. For nearly 80 years, France and England had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict fought not only by kings but also by mercenaries, noble factions, and shifting alliances that made life in villages like Domremy perilous. Armies crossed the countryside often, raiding, looting, and burning, and though Joan was a child, she grew up in the shadow of devastation. Her family were peasants. Her father Jacques d'Arc was a farmer who also served as a village official, collecting taxes and guarding livestock, while her mother Isabelle Romy was deeply pious, known for teaching her children prayers and duties of faith. They had little wealth, but they were respected, steady people, living in the rhythm of seasons, harvests, and mass. Joan was described by those who knew her as a strong, serious child, hardworking and devout, spending much of her time helping her mother, spinning wool, and tending animals. In many ways, she appeared destined for the same obscure life lived by countless peasant girls before her. Yet from an early age she seemed to carry something within her, a force that set her apart. The world around her was collapsing, France was fragmented, and the English had gained the upper hand in the war. By the time Joan was born, the French King Charles VI was a broken figure, plagued by bouts of insanity, leaving his kingdom divided between rival factions, the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians, who had allied themselves with the English. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, had struck at the heart of French pride. It disinherited the Dauphin, recognizing Henry V of England and his heirs as rightful rulers of France. To many, it seemed France itself was finished, destined to become a province of an Anglo-Burgundian empire. In this climate of despair, Joan's story begins to turn. At the age of 13, while working in the fields, she later testified that she began to hear a voice and see a blinding light. At first she was terrified, but gradually she came to believe the voices belonged to heavenly figures. Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she claimed, spoke to her with clarity and purpose. They instructed her not simply to live a good Christian life, but to undertake an impossible mission. She was to drive out the English, to restore the Dauphin Charles to the throne of France, and to see him crowned at Reims Cathedral, the ancient coronation site of French kings. It was an outrageous command. Joan was an illiterate peasant girl with no wealth, no noble blood, and no training in arms. Women in her world did not ride to war or command soldiers. They married, worked, and bore children. Yet Joan never wavered in the certainty of her calling. She did not immediately reveal her visions to the world, but she held them close, waiting for the moment to act. That moment arrived in 1428, when the war reached a critical turning point. The city of Orleans, one of the last French strongholds on the Loire River, came under siege by the English. Its fall would have cut France in two and perhaps destroyed the last hope of resistance. To Joan, the voices made it clear. She must go to the Dauphin and offer herself as his servant in God's cause. In January 1429, at the age of 17, Joan made her way to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, held authority. She demanded an audience with him, insisting she had been sent by God to raise the siege of Orleans and to lead the Dauphin to his rightful crown. Baudricourt, a hardened soldier, laughed her off. To him, she was a foolish girl, perhaps mad, certainly deluded. He told her to go home to her parents. But Joan did not give up. She returned again and again, repeating her message with unwavering determination. Her conviction began to impress not only some of the soldiers but also townspeople who heard her speak. They reported that she carried herself with a strange authority, a fire in her words, and a purity in her faith that was impossible to dismiss. Her chance came when a disastrous defeat shook France. At the Battle of the Herrings, French forces attempting to intercept an English supply convoy were badly beaten, and morale collapsed further. Desperation spread, and rumors began to circulate that perhaps God had sent this strange girl as an answer. Baudricourt, who at first had dismissed Joan outright, reconsidered. Whether he believed in her mission or not, he may have thought she could at least inspire hope in a people on the verge of ruin. Finally, in February 1429, he gave her a small escort of 6 men to travel to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles resided. The journey was long and perilous, nearly 300 miles across a war-ravaged land. Joan wore men's clothing, a tunic, hose, boots, and a short haircut. A decision that scandalized some, but which she defended fiercely as necessary for protection on the road. Traveling mostly by night, the group evaded English patrols and hostile Burgundian forces. The danger was real. Had she been captured, she might have been executed or worse. Yet Joan pressed forward with absolute confidence, assuring her companions that God would guide them safely. To those who traveled with her, it seemed she carried within her an extraordinary calm, a certainty of destiny. After 11 days, they reached Chinon. The Dauphin Charles, at this point, was 26 years old and had lived his entire life in uncertainty and humiliation. Though called the Dauphin, his legitimacy was questioned by many because of the Treaty of Troyes, which had declared him disinherited. He was shy, hesitant, and surrounded by advisors who distrusted one another and sought their own advantage. Into this fragile court came the 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy, who declared without hesitation that she had been sent to save France. Charles agreed to meet her, but to test her he devised a trick. When Joan entered the great hall, he disguised himself among the courtiers, while another man sat in the position of honor. Joan ignored the decoy and walked directly to Charles, bowing before him and addressing him as the true heir of France. Those who saw it were stunned. How could this uneducated village girl, who had never seen Charles before, know him at once among so many richly dressed men? What followed was a private conversation, the details of which remain unknown. Charles never revealed exactly what Joan said to him, but he later confessed that she spoke words that convinced him of her sincerity. Still cautious, he sent her to Poitiers to be examined by a panel of theologians. There she was questioned relentlessly about her visions, her faith, and her intentions. Though she had no formal learning, she responded with a mixture of simplicity and firmness that impressed the scholars. Asked why she had come, she replied, "I am not afraid, for God is with me. I was born for this." At last, Charles agreed to give her a chance. She was provided with a suit of armor, a white banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, and a small army preparing to march to Orleans. Joan, who had never commanded soldiers before, was about to take on a role unlike any in history. She declared that she would not kill, but she would lead, inspire, and guide. Her very presence, she insisted, would change the course of the war. When she first appeared before the army, many soldiers scoffed. What could this farm girl know of war? But soon they began to see something extraordinary. She banned swearing, insisted on prayer before battle, drove prostitutes from the camp, and demanded discipline from men who had lived in chaos. She carried herself not as a servant but as a commander, and her certainty was infectious. Hardened soldiers who had known only defeat began to believe again. Even the people of Orleans, trapped within their walls and starving, clung to the rumor of a maid sent by God to save them. And so, in April 1429, Joan of Arc, once an anonymous girl from a village no one had heard of, rode to war. The siege of Orleans awaited her, and with it, the chance to change the fate of France forever. When Joan of Arc rode into Orleans in April of 1429, France was broken, despairing, and exhausted from nearly a century of war. For months, the city had been under siege by English forces, surrounded by a ring of fortified bastions that cut off supplies and threatened starvation. The inhabitants were on the edge of collapse. Soldiers muttered about surrender, citizens wept in fear, and many believed the fall of Orleans would be the death knell of France itself. Yet when Joan arrived, clad in gleaming armor, carrying her white banner embroidered with the holy names of Jesus and Mary, hope burst forth like fire from dry kindling. She rode in through the Burgundy Gate, surrounded by her escort, and the people swarmed to see her, crying Noel, as though it were Christmas itself. Witnesses later recalled how her presence changed the mood of the entire city. Priests rang church bells in her honor, women threw flowers at her horse, and hardened captains found themselves stirred by her conviction. At first, however, the French commanders were cautious. Orleans was heavily fortified by the English, who had built a dozen strongholds, or bastilles, around the city. Assaulting them directly had already proven suicidal, and Charles's advisors feared that Joan's zeal would lead to reckless disaster. They tried to keep her in a symbolic role, parading her to inspire the troops but withholding real authority. Yet Joan refused to be a mere mascot. She rode to the city walls, spoke to the soldiers face to face, and even sent a letter to the English demanding they withdraw in the name of God. The English, astonished that a teenage girl dared challenge them, mocked her as a witch, a whore, a lunatic. But their insults only fueled her resolve. Soon the stalemate broke. Joan insisted on leading an assault against one of the English bastilles. At first, the seasoned captains hesitated, unwilling to take orders from a girl. But her energy was infectious, her confidence unshakable, and the men followed. In the charge, Joan was everywhere at once, riding to the front lines, shouting encouragement, waving her banner high above the din of battle. Unlike most commanders, she carried no sword in her hand. She held only her standard, saying it was enough for her to be at the forefront, to show her men the way. To the soldiers, it was as though the sight of her banner itself gave them courage, and they stormed the English positions with newfound fury. The fighting was brutal. Arrows whistled, cannons roared, and the French struggled to gain ground. At one point, Joan was struck by an arrow, the shaft piercing her shoulder. She staggered, bleeding, but refused to be carried away. Instead, she pulled the arrow from her own flesh, prayed briefly, and returned to the ramparts, raising her banner once more. The soldiers roared in response, surging forward as though her refusal to fall had broken the spell of fear that had haunted them for years. By the end of the day, the English fortress had fallen. One by one, over the next week, the English strongholds around Orleans collapsed under relentless French assaults. Joan was at the heart of every attack, fearless in the face of death, urging the men on with words that mingled divine command with raw human passion. On May 8, 1429, the siege was lifted. The English, stunned and humiliated, retreated. Orleans was free. The news spread across France like wildfire. For nearly a century, the English had dominated the war, and French morale had sunk lower with every passing year. Now, thanks to a teenage girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, the tide seemed to have turned. But Joan was not finished. She pressed for further action, urging Charles and his generals to capitalize on the momentum. She led French forces in a lightning campaign along the Loire River, capturing the towns of Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. At Patay, her troops clashed with a large English army commanded by some of their most experienced captains, including Sir John Fastolfe and the feared Talbot. Unlike the disastrous Battle of Agincourt, where French knights had been slaughtered en masse, this time the French struck with speed and precision. Guided by Joan's unrelenting faith, they charged before the English could set their defensive positions, routing them completely. Hundreds of English soldiers were cut down, and their leaders fled in disarray. It was one of the most decisive French victories in the entire war. For the first time in decades, the French were not only fighting but winning. Everywhere Joan went, she breathed new life into a beaten people. She insisted on daily prayers, compelled soldiers to confess their sins, and demanded discipline, forbidding looting and debauchery. To some, she seemed impossibly pure, a saint in armor. To others, she was frightening, her eyes alight with something beyond human, a fanatic who bent men's wills through sheer force of belief. Whatever the truth, her impact was undeniable. The Dauphin Charles, who had hesitated so long in indecision, now had an army transformed by her presence. Joan urged him toward the ultimate goal, coronation at Reims. For centuries, Reims Cathedral had been the sacred site where French kings were anointed with holy oil, cementing their legitimacy. Yet Reims lay deep within territory controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. To march there seemed suicidal. But Joan insisted it was God's will. She told Charles that once he was crowned, France would truly belong to him, and the people would rally to his side. Against the advice of his cautious counselors, Charles agreed. The march to Reims was a gamble unlike any other. Through towns and cities that might have resisted him, Charles advanced with Joan riding at his side. Yet, instead of opposition, the people welcomed them. Town after town opened its gates, inspired by Joan's presence and the sudden belief that victory was possible. What had seemed impossible weeks before now unfolded with astonishing ease. On July 17, 1429, Charles entered Reims Cathedral. The great church was filled with nobles, clergy, and soldiers, their eyes fixed on the young king as the sacred oil was placed upon his brow. Joan stood proudly at his side, holding her banner. Witnesses recalled how she wept with joy, crying that the will of God had been fulfilled. For a moment, France itself seemed reborn. The girl who only months earlier had been mocked as a delusional peasant now stood at the very heart of French destiny. She had lifted the siege of Orleans, won a string of victories along the Loire, and brought the Dauphin to his coronation as King Charles VII. Her mission, as she had declared it to her voices, was accomplished. Yet even in triumph, shadows loomed on the horizon. For Joan, the days of glory were not the end, but the beginning of a path that would lead her into danger, betrayal, and tragedy. The coronation at Reims had been the pinnacle of Joan of Arc's mission. Yet Joan herself was not satisfied. France remained divided, its capital Paris still under enemy control, and the Burgundians, Frenchmen allied with the English, continued to choke the kingdom from within. Joan's visions had not told her to stop, and she refused to rest while her country remained in chains. But here lay the problem. Joan's courage, so vital in the darkest moments of despair, now clashed with the timidity of the king and the ambitions of his court. Charles VII, cautious by nature, had achieved legitimacy through his coronation. He had what he wanted most: recognition as the anointed king of France. For him, the next step was diplomacy, consolidation, and careful negotiation. But Joan saw things in absolutes. France was not free until Paris was liberated and the English driven from its soil. Anything less than action was betrayal. That tension erupted in September 1429, when Joan persuaded Charles to authorize an assault on Paris. The city was held by the Burgundians, fortified, and defended by English troops. Many of Charles's advisors argued against the attack, warning that the capital could not be taken without a long and bloody siege. But Joan believed God was with her, as he had been at Orleans, and she would not be denied. She rode to the walls of Paris, once more carrying her banner high, urging her soldiers forward. The assault was fierce. Arrows rained down, cannons boomed from the ramparts, and French troops tried desperately to scale the defenses. Joan herself was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, collapsing into the mud as the fighting raged around her. Yet even wounded, she refused to retreat, calling out for her men to keep pressing the attack. Only when the king's commanders sounded the order to withdraw was she carried from the battlefield. Paris remained in enemy hands. For the first time, Joan had failed. This failure marked a turning point. The nobles at court, already wary of Joan's influence, seized upon it as proof that she was reckless, even dangerous. To them, she was a peasant girl who had overstepped her role, meddling in matters of strategy and politics that belonged to men of rank. Charles himself grew distant, retreating into the council of advisors who saw Joan less as a savior than as a rival. Still, Joan pressed on. She led smaller campaigns in the following months, but with diminishing support. Her forces were poorly supplied, her authority undermined, and her victories no longer decisive. She was restless, unwilling to accept half measures, and her boldness increasingly left her exposed. By the spring of 1430, her enemies were ready to strike. On May 23rd, at the town of Compiègne, Joan rode out to confront Burgundian forces besieging the city. She fought fiercely, rallying the defenders, but the tide turned against her. As the French attempted to retreat back into the safety of the gates, the drawbridge was raised too soon. Joan, still on the battlefield, was cut off. Surrounded by Burgundian soldiers, she was dragged from her horse and captured. For the first time since she had appeared on the stage of history, the Maid of Orleans was no longer free. Her capture was catastrophic. The Burgundians knew her worth, and they knew the English would pay handsomely to have her. To the English, Joan was more than an enemy commander. She was a living symbol of French resistance, a girl whose victories had humiliated them and shattered their myth of invincibility. Worse, she claimed her authority came from God. To leave her alive was to admit that God favored France. To destroy her was to prove she was nothing but a fraud, a witch, a heretic. In late 1430, the Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres. It was a transaction as cold as it was devastating. Joan, who had given everything for France, found herself abandoned by her king, betrayed by her countrymen, and delivered into the hands of her deadliest foes. The very voices that had guided her now fell silent in her darkest hour. She was taken to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy. There, she was imprisoned, guarded day and night, chained to her bed, and denied the rights usually afforded to prisoners of war. She was not to be treated as a captured knight or commander, but as something far more dangerous, a heretic who threatened the order of Christendom. The English intended not just to silence her, but to discredit her utterly, to tear apart her story until nothing remained but shame. And so, the stage was set for her trial. A spectacle of power and politics disguised as justice, where priests and scholars would gather to tear down a 19-year-old girl who had dared to believe she was chosen by God. When Joan of Arc was captured at Compiègne in 1430, her fate was sealed. The Burgundians, allies of the English, held her for ransom, and unlike noble prisoners who were often redeemed by their kings, Charles VII made no attempt to buy her freedom. Instead, the English paid the price and took possession of her. To them, she was more than a prisoner of war. She was a living threat. If God had truly spoken through her, then perhaps God was not with England. She had to be broken. She was 19 years old, already worn by battles and captivity, and now she faced something more terrifying than any battlefield. A trial designed not to judge her fairly, but to destroy her. The man presiding over her fate was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a staunch ally of the English. He gathered a tribunal of theologians and clerics, many sympathetic to England. The charges against her were carefully chosen: heresy, witchcraft, false visions, and the scandal of wearing men's clothing. In truth, the trial was never about justice. It was about politics. If Joan could be branded a heretic, then her victories and Charles VI's coronation at Reims could be dismissed as the work of the devil. The interrogations began in January 1431. Day after day, Joan was questioned for hours by men far more educated than her. She could not read or write, yet she held her ground with intelligence and courage. When asked whether she believed herself in God's grace, a trick question meant to trap her, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Even her judges were startled by the brilliance of the answer. But the trial was merciless. They pressed her on her visions, demanding to know whether the saints who guided her were truly from God. They showed her the instruments of torture, threatening to break her body until she confessed. Joan never wavered. She told them her voices were real, that God had guided her. At last, exhausted and ill, she was tricked. Promised her life if she confessed, she signed a paper, one she could barely understand, admitting to heresy. For a brief time, she was spared the stake and sentenced to life in prison. But soon she realized the truth. She would not be free. She would waste away in chains, silenced forever. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace of Rouen. She wore a simple white gown and a paper crown marked with the words, "Heretic, relapsed." Before a crowd of thousands, she was bound to a wooden stake surrounded by kindling. Priests urged her to renounce her voices, to save her soul. She refused. Instead, she prayed aloud, crying the name of Jesus again and again as the flames rose around her. Eyewitnesses later said the crowd wept. Even hardened English soldiers, who had jeered at her, were shaken by her courage. The executioner confessed he feared damnation for what he had done. When the fire died down, her ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine, so no relics could remain, no shrine could be built. The English believed they had erased her forever. They were wrong. Her death did not crush France. It inspired it. The woman condemned as a witch became a martyr in the eyes of her people. Within 25 years, the war turned in France's favor, and Charles VII, the same king she had crowned, ordered a retrial. In 1456, the papal court declared the trial at Rouen null and void. Joan was cleared of all charges. She had been innocent and her judges corrupt. Centuries later, her legend only grew. She became a symbol of courage, of resistance, of faith in the face of impossible odds. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. But her sainthood had begun long before. Joan of Arc lived only 19 years, yet in that short time, she transformed a kingdom. And though her enemies silenced her body with fire, her voice, the voice of conviction and defiance, has never been silenced. Enjoyed this video? Please subscribe to our channel for more.